This is our final panel. The title is The Way Forward, and the objective is to work out how we take this agenda forwards. So, for me, here are four important questions. So, the first one, this is for all of you, but also for the panel. What are the key research questions for academics? We've heard of just an hour ago, a brave new effort to do trust and social capital. There's clearly a range of research questions in that area that talented scholars could be putting their minds to. But what are the other ones that would firm up the academic basis for these measurements? Eric last night set out perhaps an even longer term and even more ambitious possible research agenda. I think that is one which I'm very interested in. I think for the purposes of this discussion, we will keep it narrowly focused on the research questions that fit in with the World Bank's and others' calculation of wealth metrics. So that's question one. Where should academics go? Question two is on the policy side. So who are the key actors, institutional actors, in a coalition that might give rise to acceptance of this indicator? And within that coalition, question three is who are the particular individuals that need to be convinced and what might convince them? So to put it in another way, what is a theory of change that would deliver change here, to use that much overused phrase? And then lastly, if we think we've got some kind of agenda emerging in terms of what needs to be done on the academic front, what needs to be done on the policy front, who are the key people, what do they need to be convinced? The question that we should be asking ourselves, I think, is this actually realistic? Because there's no point pushing harder or further on this if it's not. Now, my prior is that it is. We've just heard that things are changing, there's demand, there's already a proliferation of supply. But it's good to do that sanity check. So they're the four questions I'd like to frame the panel. Diane, as we've just heard from you extensively, I might leave you to last. And could we perhaps go from... Well, Dimitri's writing furiously. So Kirk, you've dodged that one. Well done. We'll go from Kirk to Glenn-Marie to Dimitri, and then back to Diane.
Thank you. That's a good framing of the final session. And to start off with the academic agenda, and we're responsible for pulling this particular piece of the agenda together. My sense is that the broad framework is understood by at least that part of academia, the economists who are active in academia. That the essential features of it were given to us beautifully by Marty at the beginning. I don't hear many criticisms of the basic framework. I have my biases, maybe I don't hear some things. But the agenda then becomes, if it's not an issue of the framework, then the other thing that Marty said is all of this assumes that we're talking about a comprehensive measure of wealth. And there's an enormous agenda, and we saw the discussion we triggered with our social capital paper. So I think there's a lot of scope there. And then are there academic questions about how you relate, how an indicator affects policy and decision making? There's some other aspects, but to my mind, it's this question of comprehensivity, and that's why the bank has a big residual, right? I mean, in one sense, just to say, here's the measure of ignorance. How much can we fill? In terms of key actors on the policy side, as a World Banker, you always focus on the finance minister, inevitably. It's where the whole portfolio of decisions has to come together. And so that's sort of my simple answer. we should think more broadly. The finance ministers are also controversial figures in many cases. Are there other individuals that we should engage with? In terms of individuals, we have this problem inside the bank that so much of the agenda inside the bank is carried by a personality of one sort or another. I think is a fair statement. It is indeed key to find a champion who is playing that role, who is taking a lead inside an agency like the World Bank, who is respected and has power to change things. And it's partly a question of where within an institution like the World Bank this work should reside, and that's something we're grappling with now, because it does require ongoing care and feeding. Not a lot, but it does require, because again, you're collecting new data. So again, a simple-minded answer there. Is this realistic? I spent 15 years in the World Bank working on this stuff. And a couple of years before I left, it suddenly became, oh, of course we want to do this. We want to report this indicator on net savings, especially in any country that's producing minerals and oil. All of a sudden, it became, of course, this is something we should do. And that has progressed tremendously since I've left. That may say something about my effectiveness inside the institution. And Glenn Marie has been a very important part of that process. So we've taken a very, very skeptical bunch of macroeconomists inside the World Bank to the point where they say, yes, actually, this makes a lot of sense for many of the countries where we're working. There's 40 countries where the mineral energy side is really important. And the next phase is to say, well, it's not just for those countries. The agenda is broader. But there's been a huge advance inside the World Bank, and it's a tough institution to change.
Great, thank you, very helpful. From one former World Banker to a present.
I'm going to talk about two things that are related. One, just to continue on this work, we're starting this year, we're in the process of doing a new Wealth of Nations update, and hopefully the idea is to be doing this, say, every other year. One of the issues, jumping ahead to what's realistic, the challenge has always been, can you produce reasonable estimates in a timely manner? Because a one-time number or occasional isn't going to make it into the systematic kind of analysis that people do. So one of the things, Kirk mentioned this, and this has been a really kind of a sea change in the World Bank. With this Wealth of Nations, I have a co-team leader who's from our macro-fiscal management department. This has never happened before. We have a core advisory group of 5 of the chief economists who are enthusiastically pushing this. There's a diagnostic, very deep diagnostic piece of work that's done every 5 years or so in advance of the banks defining what its engagement will be with every country. About half of them now are using the genuine savings or wealth. There was a very important study done by one of our the director for the Development Economics Group a few years ago for the Central Asian countries, called diversified development. And he said, diversification is a big issue for many of the resource-rich countries, like the Central Asian ones. But economists have always looked at it in terms of how do we diversify trade, or maybe how do we diversify production? And part of the reason is we have good statistics on this. But he said maybe that's the wrong approach, because really the basis of production, of trade, is the asset. So we have to look at what are the assets that a country has. They did a very comprehensive study of all countries, the US, Australia, middle-income countries. How had they, which were originally resource-rich, how had they grown and diversified? And they came up with a bunch of very, very different policy prescriptions, which we are going to be making one of the central focuses of this work going forward. How can we apply this approach and the policy recommendations that come out of that to other countries and perhaps influence what they're doing? OECD has started some very interesting work expanding total factor productivity to include natural capital and developing what they call multi-factor productivity. In other words, yes, we might agree that this is a good concept, but how are we actually going to use this? What particularly in terms of indicators or analysis to inform policy, what do we have that uses this information? And I think we have more of this now. If we can get the World Bank, and I think we're halfway there and have a very good chance at getting this more systematically in the diagnostics that are done, this will also have a big impact on our countries. Ministries of finance are very important, but I was recently in Botswana talking to the senior advisor there who said, please keep doing this because the fact that the World Bank and the IMF are promoting this is very important for us. And there's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. If they see people whom they think are important or leaders doing this, then the countries are likely to do it. And if we see that the countries are doing this, then that helps us promote it as well. I want to turn to one particular part of the research agenda, and that has to do with ecosystems and ecosystem services. We've been working with a group of economists, environmental economists, and accountants to see how we can move the agenda on valuation forward. And we will have a revised paper for distribution probably in the early fall. The longer-term objective is to get this and the ecosystem accounting eventually to the point of becoming a statistical standard the way the central framework is. Now that took 20 years. These things don't change very often. A new standard for national accounts has been coming out roughly every 15 years, so you can't expect this to happen overnight. But we will then have to start a big process here that would involve a very large group. We'd have to get endorsement from the economics profession that this is the right way to go, because the national accountants are going to be very, very hesitant to step in. So far they've said already, we simply don't have the expertise to think about valuation of these services or even of the assets. We're trying to define now what are the groups that we have to bring in to make this change in the longer term.
Great. So I won't push you on specific names then if you're in the process, perhaps for later. Dimitri.
Thanks. I think I'll focus in particular on the research areas, but research areas which are intensely policy relevant, of which two, I think, come to the fore in my mind. I don't know how much or whether you talked about this at all yesterday, but I know that if Martin Wolf were here today, he would want to talk about macroeconomic policy, and I think he'd say something along the following lines. GDP is something that we can actually measure, and we have data on relative prices. Wealth is something whose value depends on expectations of future valuation, and therefore is very sensitive to psychology. It's very sensitive to mood changes, whether you call it animal spirits or irrational exuberance. The world may look exactly the same one morning after a financial crash in terms of all the things that are out there, but actually the valuation of all those things may have come down quite dramatically on account of changes in expectations. And we talked about this, Eric mentioned this yesterday. And these things will co-vary, whether it's the value of a building or a factory or an institution or the information in your head. All of these things will be less valuable if you wake up one morning and you go, Christ, the new economy wasn't quite what it was sold as. The demographics look much worse than I thought, and oops, China looks a little overextended as well. Everything that we have is of lower value. In the limit, if you expect thermonuclear war next week, it doesn't matter how good your share portfolio looks or whether you're going to complete the PhD, your wealth is pretty valueless. So that means that you not only get a lot of sensitivity and volatility on account of expectations, but also the correlation across all assets makes this a real problem. And it is, in a sense, a characterization of the macroeconomic problem we are in today. Whether you like the term savings glut or not, we can tell ex post that there is an ex ante excess of desired saving over desired investment, as evidenced by the fact that the ex post risk-free real interest rate is 0 or negative right now. We are simply not putting savings into things with great returns because for whatever reason we don't think those returns are there. That in a sense is what you read from the markets, and that may be to do with paradox of thrift. It may be to do with the fact that there's a collective action problem. When everybody else expects everyone to stop spending, the first thing you do is you stop spending, you retrench on banks, retrench on extending credits, businesses cut employment, and they make those prophecies self-fulfilling. Eventually you have hysteresis effect on the stock of capital through lack of investment, lost skills, and so on, and actually your capacity begins to shrink, and the very thing you feared, which is slower growth, becomes a reality on account of your actions and your expectations. So this role of expectations then leads to a corollary question: what can policy do as a means to offset changes in expectations? If it is true that the real world probably hasn't changed that much, and that maybe we were over-optimistic about the new economy at the end of 2007, maybe we're overly gloomy about it now. There are all sorts of theories, Gordon and others, who talk about the fact that actually the real innovation happened in the middle of the 20th century, and right now it's all slowed down, which is very different to the Moore's Law kind of exuberance that we saw at the height of the dot-com boom. The reality is probably the world hasn't changed that much, and governments could do an awful lot as large players in total spending in offsetting some of those shifts in sentiment among the private sector, which then become entrenched and real because valuation effects become real through the behavior of the private sector. And obviously we've seen monetary policy. There are strong arguments as to why monetary policy has reached its limits and then to some extent is creating asset bubbles in the wrong and least productive areas. There is a role for fiscal policy arguably to do exactly the opposite of what the private sector is doing, which is to start saving less and spending more. Of course, that means in the good years, it needs to offset private sector exuberance by saving less and spending more. Politically, we know there's an asymmetry. Nobody likes running large budget surplus during good years, but in principle, ironically, actually, the politics goes in the complete opposite way around. People discover austerity just when they need it, fiscal austerity just when they need it less, and are unable to remain continent in fiscal terms when they need it most. So there's a really big macroeconomic policy story that is utterly driven at its core by wealth and the relationship between stocks and flows. And I think that is a research area that's massive. Much shorter comment on another area.
Before you go on, sorry, Dimitri, before you go on, just want to clarify something.
Of course, yeah.
So just to make sure I took away the right message. Because wealth is forward-looking and because expectations matter, wealth is therefore going to be a more variable indicator than GDP. That's kind of point one.
Could be, yes.
Yep. Point two, which I think was implicit, this is a problem. Is that correct or not?
Yes.
Okay. Point three, or can you elaborate on point three? Why is this a problem?
It changes, so the valuation of the stock then changes behavior in terms of flows. So investment, consumption, employment, extension of credit are all corollaries of your expectations of the value of assets. And that's why you get, essentially why you get these substantial, the valuation of assets change when you wake up one morning. Yep. Everybody changes their behavior. Debt, unfortunately, doesn't change. That's an overhang. So then you have to start working to rebuild your net wealth. So
just to really pin this down, equity markets already move around quite drastically for these very same dynamics. They have real world consequences. The question I was asking myself is, would this be any worse than the feedbacks that we already have, which we actually did discuss, Glenn Marie, Willem, Michael, Eric, there's a discussion about this yesterday. Would the feedbacks be any worse if we had sitting alongside a flow measure, a GDP, a stock measure that was a bit more volatile?
You'd measure, yeah, okay, that's and whether you could do that is also a key question. But I think the very ability to articulate those mechanisms more clearly through better management and measurement of the stock, I think puts you in a stronger position to argue for a policy response in the right direction. Okay. I mean, it really, a lot of economists, Martin Wolf would be sort of banging his head on this table saying it's just, economically illiterate of governments to pursue austerity right now. It just makes no sense. But part of the reason they do is that we haven't articulated the relationship between stocks and flows and the drivers from stocks and flows.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Clearly enough. I probably don't have time to talk about my second issue. I think I've already squandered you can come back. I mean, the second issue, if people want to take it up, related to the stranding of assets when there are large transition risks, when there's a change in a key dominant technology, whether it's canals to railways or horse and carts to combustion engines, or at the moment, the change in the energy system. That's different to your standard change in valuation of assets due to everyday changes in tastes and preferences and policies and production possibilities, because it's subject to tipping points, it's subject to complementary dynamics. These are sectors that have a large network effect, large complements in terms of supply chain, financial institutions, capacities, government institutions as well.
I'm going to stop you there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Come back to Diane to close the circle, I should say.
Thank you. I disagree with one bit of what Dimitri said, not the macro, which I don't know anything about, but you said that things aren't changing very much, and that we've got GDP and we can measure that and we can measure relative prices. I think things are changing, and we're not measuring what's happening. There are only 5 items that get hedonically adjusted in the UK Consumer Price Index. They're all consumer electronics goods. There's all kinds of services that are just not measured at all in an economy that's 80% services. Which takes me on to my answer to the first question. I think economists need to get much more into the statistical engine room. A few weeks ago, I went to visit Chetham's Library in Manchester, where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels spent 6 weeks researching before they went out and looked around Manchester. And the librarian got the books out, the very books that Marx and Engels had read, and it was all about statistics. They were learning about how people had been measuring the economy, and then they went out and they looked at what was happening in the economy. And I think economists for the past generation have just not paid enough attention to actually what is it that we're talking about. So getting down there, related to that, a classification system, because I think whatever we do will be more powerful if we kind of effectively partition the space of what we're looking at in an agreed way. And this came up a bit in the intangible capital session yesterday. There are different terms and we're not quite sure how they add together, and is something part of human capital or part of intangible capital. So sorting out that classification system, I think, would be very powerful. It was, biology, it was with the creation of the national accounts in the first place. And then practical tools for doing cost-benefit analysis. Local planners thinking about an infrastructure project, how do they take account of social value or of tipping points in natural capital? And how do we do the valuation, not just of ecosystems, but any kinds of systems where there are network effects? And if we think about that, then we can say, here's a tool that's useful not just for natural capital, but for the whole digital economy as well, where these things are pervasive. So that's my answer on your first question. Mm-hmm. On the committees and so on, I don't really have a lot to add except to say this has to be an official effort because of the need to collect statistics on a sustained basis. They're a public good, only governments are going to do that, and you want the authority of official statistics behind it. But also it needs political champions too, so identifying the politicians who will run with the agenda. Is it realistic? I think it is, but I think it's slow. There was a great program about Barack Obama where he was comforting some staff people. They'd lost a vote in Congress that they cared about a lot, and he quoted Martin Luther King. The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And it doesn't matter that you don't see a payoff from your bit as long as you carry on doing the right thing. I've been involved in the city devolution agenda in Manchester, which has only in the past 2 years paid any dividends. I've been involved since 2009. The local politicians driving it started it 20 years ago. So I think it is a 20-year process, but it's realistic to start it.
Great, goodness. Well, we have a lot to go on there. I'm going to open up the floor. Before I do, I'm going to just attempt a very quick summary. We need a champion internally in these organisations. World Bank's coming out every 2 years with some numbers. It's the change in wealth that matters. The long arc of history says this is not going to happen overnight. Because wealth is expectations driven, it will be more variable, but that actually perhaps opens the door for better macroeconomic management if we had the indicators. Classification is key. Getting the taxonomies right is important. It has to be an official effort, and it has to have political champions. Right. So we have 11 minutes for Q&A. And I've seen 5 hands already. Let's start with Alex and move over.
Thank you. That was really great. Even coming back to Diane's sort of excellent talk, the sort of diffusion process, we seem to be talking a lot about the sort of the supply side of it. How are we going to get the statistical agencies to coordinate? And I feel like if we're going to make enough progress, we need to think about the demand side. And the demand side really, I think, ought to be kind of unilateral. You need to have a need that you have satisfied with this new amazing wealth measure. So GDP measures something, and it's something that governments like because maybe it correlates with employment and it correlates with some economic activity, so businesses like it so they can make investment decisions. This new measure, whatever it is, has to satisfy some need of presumably politicians and businesses. And Eric's example is very good, is that, you know, the 10% does satisfy a need of voters, of, you know, maybe sort of disenfranchised sort of minority or whatever it is. And, you know, maybe we should be even more ambitious. You know, maybe we can come up with an index that can replace GDP because we'll be better at, if you like, predicting or satisfying that need for things that politicians care about. One tiny example that has been used recently is this measure of economic complexity. And it's a strange thing. But developed by Ricardo Hausman and Cesar Hidalgo at Harvard and MIT. And it's a strange measure, and it's not in the public domain, but one thing it has done, it has been very highly kind of correlated in a forward sense with GDP, and banks have adopted it in order to make investment decisions. So when they can see something that they can make money out of, they would adopt it. So if there is something that politicians can win votes from, and something that banks and financial institutions can make money from, that could be a winner.
Great. Thank you very much. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. We're moving over to Willem.
A few points. First, I think the main stranded asset in the foreseeable future is going to be human capital. And we better be ready for that. Not the stuff in the ground, not oil and gas. And Mark Carney should really start lecturing about that. Second, I don't think it's right to say that politicians don't use fiscal policy because they don't understand stock flow dynamics or how to see it. It's I think it's much simpler, right? The only fiscal policy that works in current circumstances is monetized fiscal stimulus that requires cooperation between the monetary fiscal authorities. In the euro area, that's verboten, right? In the US, you have political gridlock. In Japan, the Minister of Finance doesn't want to play. They basically don't understand the unique nature of money. It's not a liability in any meaningful sense. And then final point, I do think that we should, very much in favor of the wealth dimension, but we should refine our flow measure, you know, to a sort of what I would call comprehensive national income measure, such that the wealth measure, in principle, is the net present value of these flows. They should hang together in that way. Otherwise, I think that it would really help sell both, I think.
Great, thank you. So, Michael, Marty?
One question is, in recent history, where have actually new indicators been generated? And what was the process? And so the two things that stick in my mind, and I may be missing others, is PISA, which came out of OECD, the measurement of educational quality, and the other one is Doing Business, which came out of the World Bank, which have both had major policy implications.
And the World Economic
Human Development Index, but all these other indices are slapping prior indices together. Both PISA and Doing Business generate new data. Everything else pretty much, World Economic Forum does a few surveys, but they're not randomly sampled, blah, 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 etc. So So there's this. So those two that I happen to be aware of that generate original numbers are both getting at pieces of the wealth equation, the quality of human capital and the quality of institutional arrangements.
Corruption perception index.
Yeah. Yes. So there are a bunch of perception. Yeah. That's
a survey.
Yeah.
Dedicated survey.
Right. The question then is, all of these get at pieces of the wealth equation. And is the next step in the pieces of the wealth equation, on the one hand you can work on the framework, but isn't the actual data work supposed better done piecemeal until there are much stronger original data out there that then allow things to be summarized?
Before you hand the mic over, on doing the Doing Business report, you said earlier that you were attacked for it. And naturally enough, any wealth measure, any ranking, countries near the bottom are not going to like it. Countries who are lower than they think they should be are not going to like it. What was it that enabled the bank to push through against those attacks in the Doing Business survey?
Initially, when the data were prepared, nobody took notice. And when they came out, people said, wow, what is this? And so it
was stealth, doing it on the sly.
It was there was a stealth effect there. So as long as you haven't seen the stuff, you're not quite as agitated.
And by the time it was published, it's too late to pull it. Although wasn't there some minor scandal about this?
There were all the project does, and that's why it's difficult fundamentally to attack, it's playing back to governments what governments have made. It's codifying laws and regulations.
Okay.
And say, if you disagree with a number, then you're disagreeing whether or not you've made that law. And so that gives it, to my mind, the biggest strength. Mm-hmm. And then the ranking stuff gives it political salience. Mm-hmm. And that's where the attacks come, the biggest attacks. And they have this dual nature. On the one hand, it's attacks, and you have to deal with it. At the same time, those governments that have attacked most all reformed. And so it does both. And then, anyway, lots of stories.
And the attacks are useful for cementing its place as a focal point. I mean, if everyone, perversely, the attack is actually a benefit because it makes it the focus of discussion and turns it into the focal point. Yeah, it gives it credibility.
Has, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And then at the end of the day, however, it has to be of such a... People have to have some basic agreement that it matters, what you're picking up, and that doing something about it matters. And there are only two countries in the world, Venezuela and Zimbabwe, that went in different directions. Everybody else went in the directions suggested by the indicator.
Great, thank you very much. Marty.
I thought to just spend 2 minutes or so going back to the original origins of the perception that we need, what I'll call comprehensive accounting, but here is called wealth, I think, but they're really related to each other. It was, I believe, the 73-74 oil shock, which was a big oil shock after the Yom Kippur War, and then there was, I think in 78, 79, there was another secondary shock that was pretty big, although not quite as big as the 73, 74. And the research question then stuck its head up out of the ground naturally was, are we economists and others really not missing a big part of the picture because we're not accounting for the depletion of these resources? I think that was the original impetus to account for the depletion. And that was the first research question, and we developed an apparatus. I think we answered that question, so we have one early success because the World Bank, under Kirk and his team, as I noted once before, they made estimates of the status of 12 minerals. They broke them out, they introduced the production, and they introduced the cost, and out of that, the little hand waving, I transformed that into hoteling rentals, which is the proper way to put it in. And the answer for the world was, this is not terribly important. this accounts for about 1%. There's a change in GDP or NDP or whatever. Then further questions arose, but we did have success with this one initial question of the role of depletion. That's not saying it's not important for particular countries like Kuwait. It's dominating for them. But for the world as a whole, this greening up of accounting by allowing for depletion just doesn't do very much for the picture. Many other forces, like estimates of depreciation, are far more dominant in saying an influence on NNP out of GDP.
Thank you. Right, we are almost at time. I'd like to give the panel a quick opportunity to say any final remarks, and then I'll wrap up. We'll have some lunch, and we can go and tour some serious wealth. So, Glenn-Marie, you look like you're urgently in need to talk.
I urgently want to just mention some of the part of the new Changing Wealth of Nations is it turns out that sort of secretly over the last 10 years, some colleagues at the World Bank have been compiling and harmonizing household surveys. We have about 5,000 of them, and our colleagues in the education department have estimated Mincer equation parameters for 141 countries, so that part of this will be applying the Jorgensen-Fraumeini lifetime earnings approach to very detailed information for about 140 countries over a 20-year period to estimate human capital. As far as I know, and Kirk will be really very much involved in this work, this will be the first time that we will have very widespread global estimates of human capital based on country-level data. For sure, there are going to be a lot of problems, micro, macro data issues, but I think this will move forward this agenda on human capital tremendously by putting this database out there. And in terms of the PISA scores in particular, Barrow and Lee just came out with a book last year trying to do their own adjustments for quality, and there's a whole agenda on human capital that's already being put together of work that could be done to further refine this quality of education, health, etc.
Great, thank you. Shall we move from Diane across? You don't have to take the opportunity, but if you have one or two last thoughts to leave us with, please do.
I have one last sentence, which is we need to think about using big data sources, including crowdsourced data and images, to get at some of these measures.
Great, thank you.
I think one way forward, I mean, we have a broad agenda here. When we're talking about comprehensive wealth, we're hinting that, and we talked about many pieces of the puzzle, that there is a number of pieces, some things which are pretty well measured by something like genuine saving for the produced and natural capital in terms of commercial depletable assets. We still have some issues on living natural capital and ecosystems and things like that, but we're plugging away on that as well. But what would a small set of indicators for, let's imagine an institution that is charged to report to Parliament, not to a minister, right, not right, to Parliament, every year on the state of the future. What would the set of indicators be? I'm biased. I would say a key one would be some net saving measure. Net creation of real wealth is what we're looking for. It probably would include, this list would probably has to include TFP growth estimates. I mean, we need to institutionalize that, say that year by year, this is one of the performance indicators that we really have to care about. Quality of education, maybe the PISA score is the right one to use there. How has our PISA ranking changed from year to year? And then on the technology R&D side, it's something about expenditures or patents granted, or I mean, there's a bunch of people who worked on the measurement issues there, but you'd like to pick what is the key indicator that you could use. So in my mind, a fairly small set of really key indicators like that, starting from wealth, these are all talking about wealth in different ways. Right? Quality of education, the building up of science and technology, of knowledge, right, is about wealth. TFP growth is picking up how more efficiently we can or cannot produce wealth, right, going forward. And then we have the saving indicator. So that would, I think that if I were looking for a way forward, that would be the sort of institution I would think about, and the sort of indicators I would think about. We don't want to hang everything on one poor little number, the savings number, right? But there's some other key ones that complement and that are, in one way or another, talking about wealth.
Great. And Dimitri, last not least.
Yeah, two quick points, one specific, one generic. Willem he's gone, but he's absolutely right about the importance of a reframing of the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy. As things stand, you tend to have government and the private sector act as Stackelberg leaders, and the central bank responds with a reaction function. That needs to change, and it throws up interesting institutional questions to do with central bank independence and the primacy of parliamentary sovereignty. The key actors here will have to be treasuries, central banks, academics, the World Bank, OECD, IMF, the usual bodies, to push for this kind of change through an awareness of the role of wealth. The second point, more generic, if you're going to look at wealth, you really have to look at what generates collective expectations. And I probably wasn't very clear what Diane just said about change. I obviously didn't express myself very, very well. I wasn't suggesting change doesn't happen. On the contrary, if I turned around to you guys and said 10 years ago the words Bebo, Snapchat, Twitter, and selfie stick, you'd think I've got a speech impediment or some sort of mental hindrance. The world changes very quickly, but my point is that if the stock market collapses overnight, it's got more to do with the collective response and the domino effect of changing expectations than it actually has to do with any real change in technologies, processes, know-how, and so on. And we need to understand, if we're going to talk about assets and wealth and assets are in your head. It's back to that discussion we had yesterday. The laws of thermodynamics will exist even if people don't, but wealth will not, and that's the valuation effect, and I think it's central to this discussion.
Well, that is a great sentence, I think, on which to end this panel. So everyone, please join me in thanking the panel for the discussion.